Hello everyone. In the previous lecture, we learned about the anti-caste movements that spanned across the various parts of the country in the 19th and early 20th centuries. We learned that the anti-caste movements led by Dalits and non-Brahmins in India are characterized as radical efforts to dismantle the caste system and establish an egalitarian society where everyone, including women, will be emancipated. Unlike the 19th century nationalist and social reformist movements, the anti-caste movements did not aim to monopolize or homogenize the Hindu identity like Gandhi's Harijan movement. These movements sought to eliminate caste system altogether. Through a detailed analysis of the Dalit movements in different parts of the country, Dalit leaders and Dalit historiography, we got a sense of how caste interrogated the idea of nation. Discussing the issues pertaining to nation, a major observation is that of gender. In this lecture, we will begin with the idea of women and the construction of nation. The concept and trajectory of feminism in Indian context have undergone multiple transformations shaped by shifts in political structures, socio-cultural discourses, and global feminist thought. In India, feminist expressions have ranged from early social reform movements in the 19th and early 20th centuries to contemporary critiques grounded in intersectionality. These transformations are deeply rooted in the nation's colonial and even pre-colonial past. And herein I am referring to the British colonization. It also reflects its democratic aspirations and socio-political dynamics that shape the lived experiences of women across class, caste, religion, region, and so on. In this context, let us begin with one of the seminal works on Indian feminism, that is Radha Kumar's The History of Doing. Radha Kumar, in her book History of Doing, makes a significant distinction between pre- and post-colonial feminist movements. She argues that experience of colonial rule largely defined the feminist landscape of the pre-independence period, whereas experience of democracy came to characterize the post-independence era in India. This temporal bifurcation enables us to understand the shifting concerns, methods, and frameworks within Indian feminisms. Three dominant themes, which are modernity, development, and democracy, have continually shaped the feminist agenda in India. Beginning in the 19th century, a growing critique of traditionalism, orthodoxy became evident, particularly as reformers and nationalists began to frame the Hindu Indian woman as the emblem of cultural reform and civilizational progress. The late 19th century marked the beginning of sustained social reform movements that have centered on the so-called women's question, a term popularized by Partho Chatterjee. This question, however, was not merely about improving the condition of women it was also about symbolizing a broader societal transition from tradition to modernity, while keeping the tradition alive. Women were not simply passive beneficiaries of the reform. Rather, their bodies, roles, and lives became sites through which modern India negotiated its identity. These reformist efforts gained momentum alongside the rising nationalist sentiments and were further complicated by the colonial critique of Indian society. By the early 20th century, the women's question had bifurcated into two major strands. On the one hand was the constitution of the new woman, and on the other hand, the role of women in nationalist movements, especially within the Gandhian paradigm. The new woman emerged as a product of the bourgeoisie's aspiration to mold themselves in the image of the Western modern woman. This new woman was envisioned as an educated, cultured, and morally upright companion who would complement the rising middle class man. The shift also marked a break from older traditions that limited women's mobility and women's role to domesticity. Following the legal abolition of sati and child marriage, new reform efforts focused on educating women. According to Partho Chatterjee, who writes in his article, The Nationalist Resolution and the Woman's Question, the educated women served dual functions. It created women who were suitable companions to their husbands, who were becoming the new bourgeoisie, and who were also capable of teaching their sons to be the exact replica of their newly bourgeoisie fathers, or the Bhadralok. Thus, the image of an educated woman was embedded in the vision of the national progress, rooted in familial and cultural continuity. Women's increasing visibility in the Indian National Congress and the participation in the nationalist protest signaled a new political subjectivity. As Geraldine Forbes mentions in Women in Modern India, this created a distinctly feminine political role wherein women assumed the symbolic and emotional mantle of being the nurturers and protectors of men fighting for national freedom. In many ways, this reinforced existing gender binaries while reconfiguring them to fit the demands of the time. It is indeed striking how public and private gender roles reshaped themselves to align with the nationalist and reformist ideologies. In the immediate aftermath of independence, there was a widespread optimism that guaranteed their constitutional rights and the potential to bring about gender equality. The faith in constitutional rights and legal mechanisms prevailed until the mid-70s, a period that proved disillusionment for many feminists. The Towards Equality report, published in 1974-75, laid bare the gap between constitutional ideals and social realities, revealing that the condition of women have actually worsened since 1911. Middle class women in particular faced growing isolation and structural discrimination, prompting a re-evaluation of feminist concerns. A feminist discourse shifted focus. New questions emerged around women's education, their employment, and their security. The figure of the woman evolved from mother to daughter and working woman, with increasing emphasis on her identity as individual and on her productive capabilities. This was a crucial departure from early periods where women's roles were framed primarily in relational terms as wives, mothers, or daughters-in-law. The 70s saw the rise of a feminism that sought to define women's subjectivity not in relation to men but through self-exploration and autonomy. Now, a key concern during this period was bodily autonomy and the prevalence of gender violence. Rape, including marital and custodial rape, often linked to dowry deaths, became central to feminist critiques of patriarchy and state difference. The construction of new feminist subjectivity meant that women began identifying themselves outside the familial structures, bringing into focus the workplace, the street, the public sphere, and the legal system as new sites of contestation. Feminist class consciousness contributed as a radical transformation in how women's labor, both paid and unpaid, was understood. The double burden of domestic labor and professional labor featured prominently in feminist arguments. Interestingly, just as their reformist predecessors had done, the 1970s feminists continued to rely on the legal framework to advance their agenda. There was a strong belief that achieving women's rights within a legal and constitutional framework would enable women to gain freedom of choice and improve the quality of life. However, this reliance on law as a neutral and universal mechanism for justice came under serious scrutiny with events such as the Shahbano case and debates surrounding the Uniform Civil Code. These events exposed the flaws and assumptions of homogeneous Indian womanhood and brought communal and religious differences into sharp focus. As critics pointed out, behind the facade of constitutional secularism lay a reality of communal majoritarianism that marginalized the specific needs of minority women. In her seminal work, Kumkum Sangari emphasized the importance of recognizing multiple and overlapping patriarchies that operate across caste, community, and religion. By the 1990s, the heterogeneity of the category woman gained increasing scholarly and activist attention. The rise of Dalit women's movements, environmental activism, and deeper engagement with the public-private dichotomy, fully understood the diversity of women's experiences in India. This period marked the emergence of difference and intersectionality as central feminist concerns. Recognizing difference means acknowledging their identities, be it caste-based, religious, regional, or class-oriented. These identities profoundly affected how women experience oppression. Instead of treating woman as a unified monolithic subject, Indian feminism began to focus on the specific of identity. Intersectionality as a methodological tool enables an analysis of how systems of power function in conjunction, not in isolation. It allows scholars and activists to see how caste, gender, religion, and class intersect to create complex forms of marginalization. Such a lens provides a more nuanced and inclusive understanding of gender in the Indian context. With these theoretical foundations and historiographies laid, it is now pertinent to revisit the 19th century nationalist construction of womanhood, which will also tell us how an understanding through the intersectional lens would reveal a new notion of patriarchy. In this context, central questions arise. Why did the woman's question become such a pivotal aspect of nationalist and social reformist thought? How did this shape and conceptualize gender in modern India? The social reform movement in the 19th century India emerged with women's issues as one of its central goals. However, the extent to which these reforms constituted genuine emancipation remains a critical point of debate. The 19th century witnessed a global surge in the attention to women's issues. In Europe, the French Revolution was instrumental in sowing the seeds of feminist thought. Mary Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman remains a foundational feminist text that critiqued the gendered dynamics of power and argued that systematic inequality, particularly in education, rendered women weak and dependent. She famously advocated for women's rights not just in reproductive roles, but also in professional and political domains. In colonial India, the rise of the women's question was intricately linked with the emergence of the British rule. Radhakumar attributes the heightened early awareness of women's issues in Bengal and Maharashtra to the centrality of British colonial administration in those regions. This growing consciousness, she argues, stemmed from both social and economic transformations. The British presence enabled the emergence of a new bourgeois middle class whose primary objective was to distinguish themselves from the uncivilized masses. The self-differentiation was pursued by rejecting the so-called bad traditions and adopting select colonial traits, and we will discuss this soon. Radhakumar writes, this new class sought to reform itself, initiating campaigns against caste, polytheism, idolatry, animism, parda, child marriage, sati, and more, seeing them as elements of pre-modern or primitive identity. At this point, it is also important to remember that, as I have iterated in the beginning of the lecture, although on surface all these issues seem very progressive, the question we really need to ask is, did these steps really help women in concern? Importantly, not all reformist momentum can be solely attributed to British influence. The 18th century was a period of major transition marked by the decline of the Mughal rule and the shifting dynamics of regional power. For example, the anti-caste movement in the 19th century Maharashtra had older roots, partly stemming from the collapse of the Brahminical dominance with the fall of the Peshwa rule. Even though Brahmins reasserted dominance under the British, earlier disruptions had already begun to challenge caste hegemony. In Bengal, reformers like Raja Ram Mohan Roy, deeply influenced by English rationalist thought, sought to eliminate harmful practices like sati and child marriage. This transition period was marked by twin ideologies of revivalism and nationalism, often operating in tandem. In his famous Minutes on Education, published in 1835, Thomas Babington Macaulay expressed the colonial ambition to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. This newly minted elite would serve as cultural intermediaries who would emulate and enforce colonial ideas while never really becoming the colonial masters. Ashish Nandi in The Intimate Enemy writes that this identification with British rulers created a psychological subordination, describing it as identification with the aggressor. He shows how British Victorian values shaped new definitions of masculinity, also known as the Purushatva, and femininity or Naritva, particularly through a selective revival of ancient texts. Uma Chakravarti, in her essay, Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi, illustrates how Orientalist scholars like William Jones and H.T. Colebrook reconstructed a glorified Hindu past through the translation of Sanskrit texts. This reconstruction had a dual function: to discredit the Mughal period as one of moral and social decay, and to position the British as rescuers of India's lost glory. Chakravarti notes, in sum, the Europeans who had successfully constituted their own true history were now engaged in giving the Indians the greatest gift of all, a history. In other words, the British created a historical past for India. However, it is also important to remember that the Indian intelligentsia were not mere recipients of this colonial narrative. They had also actively participated in constructing and internalizing it. Women were placed at the center of this imagined past. Uma Chakravarti writes, the emerging Indian intelligentsia in the first half of the 19th century were involved in a dual encounter with colonial ideology. Awareness of the past through Oriental scholarship was countered by an equally strong negative perception of the present, which missionaries, administrators, travelers, and others were engaged in writing about. Thus, the past was idealized and the present vilified, creating an impetus for reform that centered on reclaiming national dignity through the upliftment of women. The reformist focus on women were further fueled by European critiques of Indian society. James Mill, in The History of British India, described Hindu women as being in a state of dependence more strict and humiliating than that which is ordained for the weaker sex. Nothing can exceed the habitual contempt which Hindus entertain for their women. They are held in extreme degradation, excluded from sacred books, deprived of education and of a share in the paternal property. The remarkable barbarity the wife held unworthy to eat with her husband is prevalent in Hinduism. In this context, Mill's narrative also serves as a way for the British colonizers to prove their worthiness to rule a barbaric, savage place such as the colony. Notably, Mill did not attribute this degradation to the Islamic rule, but rather to the Hindu social structure, which he saw as fundamentally barbaric. Social reformers, motivated by such critiques, sought to cleanse Indian society of these degenerate practices, often in alignment with the colonial views. In an effort to portray Indian culture as morally upright and capable of self-rule, as a part of the modernizing mission, two issues were immediately taken up, which are sati and widow remarriage. It was Raja Ram Mohan Roy who came to be known as one of the most prominent critics of sati or widow immolation. One interesting factor is that since the 18th century, British missionaries had viewed the practice of sati as an example of Hindu barbarism. In fact, they saw sati as a way to promote their civilizing mission. Later, when anti-sati sentiments were on the rise, the British Parliament refused to abolish it to avoid religious interference. Now, at this point, one thing you must remember is that although Raja Ram Mohan Roy criticized Sati, he did so to revive the great Indian and Hindu tradition. The practice of Sati gets utilized by both Ram Mohan Roy and the conservatives to prove their respective readings of the Shastras. He establishes the supremacy of the Vedas and Shastras by claiming to highlight their accurate preaching. This scientificity and logicality establishes the validity and supremacy of the Vedas and Shastras. Thus, ironically, in both their support and challenge to the practice of Sati, the conservatives and Ram Mohan Roy attempt to prove the authority and sacrosanctity of the Vedic texts as authentic Hindu ideology. It is also important to remember that Sati was neither common nor widespread. In fact, the 1829 regulation mentions that by a vast majority of people throughout India, the practice is not kept up nor observed. In some extensive districts, it does not exist. The irony is that by making anti-sati a law, it was assumed that sati is a common practice. Moreover, it gave sati or burning widow on the pyre a Brahmanical sanctity. And as Radha Kumar has observed, after the abolition, many places started adopting the tradition of sati to show their religious inclination. In fact, as late as the 1970s, there were instances of sati or widow immolation, a significant instance of which is the Roop Kanwar's death. Ashish Nandi terms it the sati abolition as an assertive defensive reaction to colonial rule roused by the divided state of feeling among Hindus. Similar sentiments were also reflected in the widow remarriage. The matter of widow remarriage took shape through the campaign inaugurated by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. He collaborated with the Bengal Brahmo Sabha and the Tattva Bodhini Sabha to initiate several written pleas for the reform of the institution of marriage, including the abolition of Kulin polygamy. In his book, Marriage of Hindu Widows, he argued a total disregard for the Shastras and a careful observance of mere usages and external form is the source of the irresistible stream of vice which overflows the country. Vidyasagar saw widow remarriage as a proper alternative to sati and enforced seclusion on widows. He heavily depended on the Shastras, just like Ram Mohan Roy, to prove his point. The opposition questioned Vidyasagar's authority over the Vedas on moral ground. The 784 petitioners of UP and Calcutta said that legalizing widow remarriage would bring back the same state of affairs as under the Nawab, namely, whosoever may wish will run away with one's wife. It is interesting to note how the degradation of moral codes is linked with the Islamic rule in India. In this way, we can say that the Hindu morality and rituals were presented as exact binary of the degrading Islamic law. In Bengal, more than 50,000 signed petitions were submitted against widow remarriage. At the core of widow remarriage debate was morality. Vidyasagar saw it as depraved morality, which others saw as upholding traditions. The Hindu Widows Remarriage Act 15 of 1856 was largely useless. In fact, the number of marriages performed were negligible. Now, let us summarize today's lecture. Today, we saw how the social reformation centered on women and their oppression to show that India is capable of getting rid of its abysmal practice of rule. The social reformers aimed to promote a new India which was superior in the spiritual realm by explicating their superiority through women's morality. In order to promote such supremacy, women were made central to the discourse. The nationalists wanted to show India's past as glorious and, more importantly, the modern nation state's ability to retain the good traditions while discarding the bad ones. We saw that sati and widow remarriage were made two intrinsic aspects of social reform. The term sati literally means a woman who is virtuous and truthful, and as an extension of the term, a woman who is chaste and totally devoted to her husband. Therefore, at the root of the word, there is a sense of self-sacrifice for the benefit of the husband and the family. The anti-sati movement marked the beginning of women's reformation in modern period. However, both in case of sati and widow remarriage, similar fate was awaiting. Instead of benefiting women, it often deprived them of their rights and freedom. Moreover, the laws did not have a prolonged impact. As we see in case of Roop Kanwar, sati has been practiced even in the 20th century. With respect to widow remarriage, we saw that it homogenized woman as a single category. It did not address the differences among women. In fact, it completely removed the relative agency women of some castes used to enjoy during earlier laws regarding ownership of their husband's property and giving it or passing it on to their daughters. This reinforces the idea that women need to be recognized as different, and that social reformation was primarily based on the interests of the upper caste women. We will discuss this aspect more in the coming lectures. In the next lecture, we will discuss women's writings as a vehicle to mark their identity. Thank you.